was 1845, and in a quiet Virginia village, a celebration of union turned into a shadowed legend whispered for generations. The bride, a young woman of refined grace and mysterious origins, had drawn the attention of everyone in the community. Her beauty was the kind that lingered in memory, but beneath her composed exterior, there existed a fragility that few could detect. The anticipation of her wedding day was palpable. The church was adorned with garlands and candlelight, a luminous sanctuary of hope and solemnity. Yet even in this radiant scene, an undercurrent of unease stirred, an inexplicable tension that neither groom nor congregation could name. The bride moved through the ceremony with quiet poise, her hands trembling subtly beneath the folds of her gown. Observers noted her distant gaze, as though she were perceiving a reality beyond the church's walls. The minister recited vows that seemed to echo through the empty corridors of time, each word resonating with both reverence and an unspoken disquiet. Guests exchanged furtive glances. A sense of foreboding grew like a shadow at the edges of candlelight. No one could have predicted the tragedy that would soon redefine the sanctity of that sacred space. Moments after the ceremony, the bride collapsed. Panic swept through the church. Men rushed forward to lift her, women gasped, children clutched their parents in fear. The minister, maintaining composure, instructed attendants to carry her to a side chamber. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and the village doctor arrived quickly but was ill-equipped for what appeared before him. The young woman's pulse was faint, her skin icy. Her breath was irregular, shallow, enough to suggest death to those untrained yet subtle movements hinted at life, barely perceptible. In the quiet church, the tension grew, mingling grief with an unplaceable dread. Word of the incident spread rapidly. Villagers debated whether she had been cursed, afflicted by some unseen malady, or the victim of divine judgment. Her family insisted she was alive, yet in the dimly lit chamber, she remained motionless, unresponsive, as hours passed, and the reality of her apparent demise settled upon the community. It was customary in rural Virginia to prepare the deceased quickly for burial. The church itself, an architectural emblem of faith and tradition, became both witness and confessional to the unfolding horror. The decision was made swiftly, perhaps too hastily, to place her beneath the church's floor. The ground beneath the altar, sacred yet cold, became her temporary resting place. Carpenters and laborers worked quietly, the sound of their tools echoing ominously in the high vaulted space. Villagers followed at a distance, uneasy but compelled by duty, fear, and fascination. Shadows flickered across walls, candlelight danced, and the church, usually a place of sanctuary, became a site of suffocating dread. Each hammer strike, each shuffle of feet on the boards above, seemed to mark a descent into a silent nightmare. As the ritual concluded, some began to notice peculiar phenomena, a faint movement under the wooden planks, a barely audible whisper, the softest shift in the floorboards as if the earth itself remembered what was placed above it. Fear, mingled with awe, gripped the congregation. The line between life and death blurred. The senses that survived clung to every anomaly, every quiver of shadow or flicker of light. Those present understood that they had witnessed not just a funeral, but a convergence of the tangible and the unknowable. The bride, though silent and still, became the fulcrum of a story that would echo across decades. Her presence beneath the church transformed the space, infusing it with an energy both oppressive and mesmerizing. Villagers spoke of strange sounds during evening services, of faint footsteps echoing in empty aisles, of candles extinguishing without cause. Children whispered of shadows that crept along walls, and adults questioned their own perceptions, unsure if they saw reality or the imprint of fear. The church itself seemed to breathe, alive with secrets, a repository for a life suspended between existence and oblivion. This was a story that merged the ordinary with the extraordinary. A simple wedding became the canvas for an enduring mystery, a testament to both human error and the limitations of understanding. The young bride's fate, wrapped in the veneer of ritual and tradition, cast a long shadow over the community. It became a tale not merely of loss but of suspense, of lingering questions about mortality, perception, and the unknowable spaces between them. Every whispered retelling carried the weight of that night, the collapse, the hurried burial, the eerie quiet that followed. By the time the church returned to normalcy, the legend had begun. The bride's identity faded in importance. What remained was the image of a figure buried alive beneath sacred stone, a presence simultaneously feared and revered. The narrative spread, amplified by every observer's interpretation, growing into an account that blurred the boundaries of history and horror. The church became more than a site of worship. It was a monument to uncertainty, a locus for reflection on the fragility of life, the consequences of haste, and the enduring mysteries that can haunt even the most familiar of places. From that night onward, the church and its buried bride existed in a state of perpetual tension, both a real and symbolic space where faith, fear, and the inexplicable coalesced. Villagers learned to approach the story with caution, to respect its presence even in absence, to acknowledge that some mysteries resist resolution. The bride, silent beneath the altar, remained a reminder that life can be fleeting, that misperception can alter destiny, and that the shadowed corners of history often contain truths too unsettling to confront directly. Even now, the church stands, its walls echoing the past. Visitors feel the weight of centuries of whispers and the unbroken quiet that follows tragedy. The young woman's story is retold, not as mere folklore, but as a dark history that challenges assumptions, tests perceptions, and reminds all who hear it that beneath sanctity can lie the most unsettling secrets. The bride buried beneath the church is more than a historical event. She is an enduring presence, a quiet horror that lingers long after the congregation has departed, a shadow of mortality and mystery intertwined, inviting reflection and reverence alike. In 1845, Virginia was a patchwork of rural communities, plantations, and small towns, each bound together by tradition, faith, and social hierarchy. Life in these areas revolved around the cycles of agriculture, local markets, and the rhythms of church attendance. The church served not only as a spiritual center, but also as a social nucleus, a place where communities exchanged news, upheld moral standards, and observed rituals that shaped identity. Within this structure, family reputation was paramount, and marriages were often both personal unions and social contracts, reflecting alliances, economic considerations, and cultural expectations. The bride's community, though modest, adhered strictly to these norms. Expectations for women were rigid. Virtue, obedience, and social conformity were prized above individual desire. Her family, keenly aware of appearances, would have been attuned to the pressures surrounding marriage, inheritance, and social standing. Weddings were public affairs, celebrated with both solemnity and festivity, drawing neighbors, friends, and extended family into events that could define perceptions for years. A disruption during such a gathering, like the bride's sudden collapse, would have been shocking, not only emotionally but socially, challenging assumptions about the reliability of tradition and human control. Medical understanding at the time was limited, particularly in rural areas. Physicians often relied on rudimentary tools, observation, and anecdotal knowledge, and the line between life and death could be uncertain. Conditions such as catalepsy, coma, or fainting could be mistaken for death, especially when observed in dim lighting or under stressful circumstances. Communities relying on these practitioners often acted on incomplete or inaccurate information, leading to decisions that, while well-intentioned, could have devastating consequences. The bride's misdiagnosis and subsequent burial beneath the church reflects this intersection of limited medical knowledge and societal urgency to maintain order and ritual propriety. The architecture and design of churches in mid-19th century Virginia also played a role in shaping experiences. These buildings were constructed with wooden floors, elevated altars, and vaulted ceilings, designed to inspire awe and reinforce spiritual authority. Beneath the floors, spaces sometimes existed for storage, crypts, or utility purposes, yet rarely were they considered for unusual burials. Using the church floor as a resting place, even temporarily, merged the sacred and the profane, creating an environment where both fear and reverence could coexist. The interplay of architecture and ritual amplified the psychological impact of the bride's burial, intensifying both dread and fascination. Culturally, rural Virginian communities held strong beliefs in the unseen. Superstition, folklore, and religious conviction intertwined with daily life. Stories of spirits, omens, and divine retribution were common and often intertwined with real events, influencing how people interpreted anomalies or tragedies. The bride's collapse and burial quickly acquired layers of interpretation beyond the practical. It became a cautionary tale, a point of moral reflection, and an encounter with what many considered forces beyond human comprehension. These narratives reinforced social cohesion, morality, and the acknowledgement of boundaries between life and death. Economically and socially, families were tightly interdependent. Neighboring households collaborated in work and defense, exchanging labor, goods, and support. Any disruption in the family unit, especially one as public as a wedding catastrophe, could ripple outward, challenging not only personal lives, but the stability of community expectations. The bride's sudden collapse and subsequent burial beneath the church would have invoked both sympathy and fear, a mix of emotional and social disruption that highlighted the fragility of life and social structure. Educational access was limited and literacy varied. Knowledge about health, hygiene, and the human body was often based on hearsay or folklore rather than systematic study. This environment made communities susceptible to misunderstanding sudden illnesses or unexplained phenomena, interpreting events in terms of divine will, moral failing, or supernatural involvement. Thus, the bride's predicament became fertile ground for stories that combined fact, conjecture, and fear, embedding itself in local memory and shaping perceptions for generations. The surrounding landscape also influenced experiences of the church and its congregation. Virginia's rolling hills, dense woods, and open fields provided both beauty and isolation. The environment could be harsh. Sudden storms, fog, and darkness created conditions where imagination and sensory perception merged, heightening anxiety. Within this setting, the church, a symbol of order and faith, became the stage for an incident that juxtaposed human vulnerability with the inscrutable power of the unknown. Ultimately, understanding the social, cultural, and historical context of mid-19th century Virginia illuminates why the bride's story captured the imagination of her community. It was not only a tale of personal tragedy, but also a reflection of societal norms, medical limitations, religious convictions, and human fascination with the liminal spaces between life and death. The church and its buried bride became a nexus for these forces, a place where history, culture, and fear converged, setting the stage for a narrative that would echo across generations, preserved in memory, architecture, and folklore. The moments that followed the bride's collapse were steeped in a silence heavier than any conversation, a quiet that seemed to press against the wooden pews and the high ceilings of the church. Villagers crowded the aisle, faces pale, eyes wide, mouths opening only to release stifled gasps. Some knelt beside her, trembling hands reaching out to touch her icy skin, hoping for warmth, for life, for any sign of her familiar presence. The faintest breath seemed to defy death, imperceptible to many, yet enough to ignite fear in those attuned to subtleties. Candle flames flickered across faces, elongating shadows, painting elongated phantoms on the walls. The village doctor arrived, a man of earnest conviction but limited experience. His hands were steady, though the tension in the air made every movement seem monumental. Palpation, observation, rudimentary tests, these were all that could be offered. As he examined her, a tremor passed through her fingers unnoticed by most, and he pronounced her life extinguished. The words were met with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and an unspoken dread. Those who had observed subtle signs of life felt a chill, a sensation that reality itself was bending around them. Preparations for burial commenced swiftly, driven by fear of ritual impropriety, of spiritual contamination, of community judgment. Laborers measured and cut the floorboards beneath the altar, each strike of hammer and chisel echoing like distant gunfire. Dust rose in thin clouds, mixing with the faint smell of candle wax and old wood, producing an almost tangible tension that seemed to seep into the congregation. The bride's body, delicate and eerily serene, was lifted with care yet urgency, the hum of whispered prayers accompanying the labor. As the coffin, or simple makeshift container, was lowered into the cavity beneath the floor, strange phenomena began to manifest. A creaking, subtle at first, emanated from the boards above. Candles flickered violently despite the absence of drafts, their light dancing unnaturally across the vaulted ceiling. Some villagers swore they saw the bride's fingers twitch beneath the linen wrappings, though by the time anyone approached, all movement had ceased. A low, almost imperceptible moan seemed to vibrate through the planks, a sound that caused many to glance nervously at one another, questioning their own hearing. In the following days, rumors spread like wildfire. Members of the congregation reported odd sensations: footsteps in the empty nave, shadows shifting at impossible angles, whispers that seemed to echo from the altar itself. Nighttime visits became a test of courage, as individuals recounted the sensation of being watched, of unseen hands brushing past them, or faint crying just beyond the reach of lamplight. Children claimed to see a figure beneath the floorboards, her face peeking through cracks, silent yet accusing. Adults struggled to rationalize what they witnessed, oscillating between fear, skepticism, and disbelief. The family of the bride was fractured by grief and uncertainty. Some insisted she had been buried alive. Others clung to hope that she had somehow survived and would return. Each interaction with the church carried an undercurrent of dread. The altar, once a place of joy and union, became a focal point of anxiety. The minister attempted to offer comfort, invoking scripture and prayers for the departed, but even he confessed to experiencing chills and inexplicable sensations during services. The line between spiritual concern and human fear blurred, leaving a congregation suspended in tension. Scholars later suggested that the phenomena could be partially explained by psychological contagion. Fear can amplify perception, and when a community collectively anticipates horror, ordinary sounds and movements can transform into seemingly supernatural events. The structure of the church itself, creaking floors, echoing chambers, and flickering light, interacted with heightened emotions to produce a sensory environment that magnified every anomaly. Yet even with this rational explanation, many could not dismiss the visceral, haunting experience of that space. Over the following weeks, the church witnessed repeated disturbances. Objects subtly shifted, unaccounted-for scratches appeared along walls, and the faintest sounds of movement emerged from beneath the altar. Villagers reported dreams of the bride, images of her reaching out, of pleading silently from her subterranean confinement. Fear began to infiltrate daily life. Some avoided the church entirely, others entered with prayers murmured under their breath, and a few audacious souls ventured beneath the floorboards with lanterns, only to find the shadows and smells of decay suffocating in their intensity. Environmental factors contributed to the unnerving atmosphere. Cold drafts infiltrated the sanctuary through cracks and windows, rustling robes and papers, creating sounds that suggested unseen presence. Fungi and dampness within the subfloor produced faint odors reminiscent of decay, further amplifying the sense of foreboding. Even animals sensitive to shifts in environment refused to enter the church, congregating instead outside, their uneasy calls carrying through the night. The combination of structural, environmental, and psychological elements created a perfect storm. Villagers began to refer to the bride's burial as a cautionary tale, warning of both literal and metaphoric dangers. It was said that those who approached the altar at night could feel her presence pressing upward, a silent accusation against hurried decisions and human misjudgment. The church had become a stage for subtle horror, a space where time, perception, and memory converged, and where the consequences of a single moment, her collapse, the misdiagnosis, the hurried burial, unfolded continuously in the fabric of daily life. Ultimately, the events beneath the church floor and the responses they generated illustrate a profound intersection of mortality, misperception, and cultural expectation. Life and death were not absolute. They existed as a spectrum shaped by observation, knowledge, and communal belief. The bride's story, marked by terror both physical and psychological, became a lasting imprint on the community, ensuring that every visitor, scholar, and observer who entered the church would confront the haunting tension between the seen and the unseen, between certainty and fear. The narrative of the bride's collapse, burial, and the subsequent haunting represents more than individual tragedy. It is an atmospheric study in human response to uncertainty, a chronicle of the eerie persistence of life where none was expected, and a demonstration of how architecture, social norms, and collective consciousness can interact to create a space where horror lingers long after a single fateful event. In the weeks and months following the bride's burial beneath the church, the village found itself suspended between disbelief and fear. Families gathered in hushed conversation, speaking of the incident with reverence and trepidation, careful to moderate the tone lest the story take on an uncontrollable life of its own. The immediacy of her collapse had transformed into a persistent memory, a focal point of speculation that infiltrated ordinary routines. Children whispered to each other about shadows beneath the altar. Adults, though outwardly composed, often glanced nervously toward the church, their steps hesitant. The bride's family experienced an emotional turbulence that was both private and public. Some mourned with profound sorrow, interpreting the incident as divine punishment or an inevitable twist of fate. Others clung to hope, refusing to accept the finality of what had transpired, citing the faintest movements or irregularities noticed at the time as proof that life might yet endure beneath the floorboards. Household tensions escalated as differing interpretations of events clashed. Faith and superstition, rationality and despair, all vying for dominance in their minds. Medical practitioners were called upon repeatedly to examine the situation, though their assessments were limited by both the tools and understanding of the era. They theorized about conditions such as catalepsy, a state of rigid immobility with slowed metabolism, or fainting spells induced by trauma, illness, or shock. These scientific explanations, while rational to some, failed to reassure the more superstitious members of the community. The uncertainty of her condition, combined with the eerie environmental cues in the church, created a potent mixture of dread and fascination. Pastors and religious leaders also weighed in, seeking to offer guidance and interpretation. Sermons referenced morality, divine providence, and the mysterious workings of God. Some ministers spoke of the bride's situation as a test of faith, an example of human fragility confronted with the unknowable. Others approached with caution, emphasizing prayer, reflection, and the importance of not disturbing sacred spaces. Their words, though measured, often amplified the collective unease, as the moral and spiritual significance of the event merged with the palpable fear emanating from the church itself. The broader community reacted with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and anxiety. Neighbors who had not been present during the wedding or burial traveled to observe the church, eager to witness any signs of the supernatural. Reports circulated of faint sounds, shadows, and unexplainable shifts in the building's structure, which, whether real or imagined, fueled rumors that extended beyond the village's boundaries. Travelers passing through the area noted the tense atmosphere, and the story began to weave itself into local folklore, a cautionary tale about the fragility of life, the danger of misjudgment, and the limits of human understanding. Psychological analysis, viewed through the lens of modern understanding, suggests that much of the communal reaction was amplified by collective perception. Fear and expectation can heighten awareness of ordinary stimuli, transforming mundane noises into supernatural portents. Shadows elongated unnaturally in dim lighting, creaking floorboards seemed to follow movement, and subtle drafts carried whispers through empty halls. These environmental factors, combined with prior knowledge of the bride's unusual circumstances, created a feedback loop of anxiety and observation. Each individual's perception reinforced that of others, making the church itself a locus for shared terror. Newspaper reports, though limited in circulation, contributed to the public's understanding and sensationalization of the incident. Editors framed the story with dramatic language, emphasizing the mysterious circumstances and the potential danger of superstition or divine intervention. Letters to the editor, often from neighboring counties, debated whether the bride had been truly buried alive or whether the events were exaggerated by fear and gossip. These publications spread awareness far beyond the immediate community, embedding the story into the collective consciousness of the region. Even daily routines were subtly affected. Some villagers avoided passing by the church at night, fearing malevolent forces or spiritual unrest. Children were warned not to play near the building, and merchants noticed changes in traffic as outsiders approached the village, some drawn by curiosity, others deterred by stories of misfortune. The incident altered not only perceptions of mortality and safety, but also the rhythm of social interaction, reminding residents that a single tragic event could resonate across time and space. Despite the fear and speculation, there were also moments of solidarity and care. Families comforted one another, shared prayers, and attempted to maintain a semblance of normal life. Villagers participated in communal rituals, seeking reassurance in routine and tradition. The church, though a site of mystery and dread, remained a symbol of continuity, its walls containing both the tragedy and the collective effort to understand and endure it. Ultimately, The community's reaction to the bride's burial highlights the intersection of human psychology, social norms, and cultural belief. It demonstrates how fear, grief, and uncertainty can shape perception, influence behavior, and create enduring narratives. The village became both observer and participant in a story that transcended individual experience, blending history, folklore, and the ineffable quality of the unknown. In this way, the bride buried beneath the church transformed not only a physical space, but also the collective consciousness, leaving an imprint that would endure in memory, in ritual, and in the shadows that haunted the aisles long after her final resting place was sealed. The night of the climactic events arrived with a stillness that seemed unnatural, a silence so absolute that even the wind held its breath. The moon cast pale light across the village, illuminating rooftops and the darkened spire of the church with a ghostly silver. Inside, the building seemed to vibrate subtly, as though anticipating the convergence of human fear and the lingering presence beneath the floorboards. Every creak of timber, every sigh of the wind against the stained glass windows, was amplified in the minds of those who dared to enter, a harbinger of what was to unfold. A small group of villagers, led by the minister and the doctor, assembled to confront the source of the persistent disturbances. Candles flickered in their hands, casting moving shadows across pews and walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and twist independently of their origin. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, candle smoke, and an underlying metallic tang that suggested decay. Heartbeats quickened, palms sweated, and voices, though hushed, trembled with unspoken anticipation. As they approached the altar, a sudden, subtle vibration rippled through the floorboards, so faint at first that some thought it imagined. The trembling grew more pronounced, accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from beneath the very foundation. The doctor knelt to examine the floor, running his fingers along cracks and seams, and noted irregularities that defied normal structural explanation. The minister began to recite prayers, voice quivering, the words interspersed with gasps as the ambient sound seemed to respond, boards groaning, shadows shifting, a faint thump echoing in time with his syllables. Suddenly, a faint movement beneath the altar caught the light. A finger, a hand, pressing upward through the gap where the bride had been interred. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Some fell to their knees, some stumbled back, and all eyes fixed on the subtle, horrifying motion. The figure of the bride, indistinct yet unmistakable, seemed to press against the floorboards, her presence simultaneously pleading and accusatory. The room grew colder, the candle flames wavering violently, as though buffeted by an unseen force. The group attempted to lift the boards, revealing the narrow cavity beneath. The bride's form was unnervingly still, yet the faintest tremors suggested life, or something that mimicked it, persisted. Some villagers recoiled, whispering prayers, invoking divine intervention. Others, driven by curiosity or desperation, leaned closer, straining to discern whether the movements were corporeal or spectral. The distinction was impossible to determine. Perception and reality blurred in the flickering candlelight. Sudden noises erupted from the corners of the church. Footsteps, whispers, the subtle creak of shifting wood. Shadows danced independently, elongated and twisted, some resembling human forms, others suggesting the presence of something entirely other. Panic surged through the assembly. Some bolted toward the doors, others clutched each other, eyes wide, hearts hammering. The minister's voice, once commanding, broke into trembling pleas for calm. Yet even he felt the suffocating weight of terror pressing against the walls. In the midst of this chaos, the bride's hand pressed more firmly against the boards as though striving to communicate or resist. The congregation's emotions, fear, awe, sorrow, and a perverse fascination, converged into a single suffocating intensity. Every breath seemed amplified, every heartbeat a drum signaling the climax of a story that had been building for weeks. The interplay between human expectation, architectural resonance, and the bride's ambiguous presence created a tension that felt tangible, a living force that pressed against every person in the room. The doctor attempted to examine the cavity, tools in hand, but each movement triggered responses that defied logic. Boards shifted inexplicably, shadows elongated toward him, and a low, almost human moan seemed to emanate from beneath the floor. The minister recited verses more fervently, Yet the sound seemed to mingle with the ambient noises, creating a discordant symphony that filled the church with the eerie sensation of being watched, judged, and beckoned simultaneously. Time became fluid. Moments stretched, compressed, and repeated in perception. Villagers reported sensations of déjà vu, of seeing themselves from a distance, of shadows interacting independently of their bodies. The church had become a liminal space, a threshold where the boundaries between life and death, physical and supernatural, human and otherworldly, were suspended. Each creak of the floor, each flicker of candlelight, reinforced the narrative that the bride, in some form, persisted beyond the ordinary constraints of mortality. By the peak of this confrontation, the atmosphere was charged with unbearable tension. Some individuals felt a physical pressure, a weight pressing down on their shoulders and chests, as if the building itself were alive. The congregation's collective fear amplified the phenomena, creating a feedback loop where expectation and perception coalesced into events that defied rational explanation. Shadows, sounds, and subtle movements intertwined, leaving every participant questioning what was real and what was imagined. The climax of the story, the moment where all human, environmental, and psychological factors intersected, served as both a revelation and a test. The bride's presence, ambiguous and enigmatic, forced confrontation with mortality, the limits of human understanding, and the enduring power of ritual and superstition. In that charged space, the villagers experienced the apex of horror, a silent, suffocating, atmospheric dread that lingered long after candles burned low and shadows receded. As the night drew on, exhaustion and resignation set in. The villagers, whether fleeing, praying, or observing in stunned silence, emerged transformed. The church remained a locus of unresolved tension, a space where the bride's story persisted, a haunting testament to human vulnerability, the fragility of perception, and the inexorable intertwining of life, death, and the unknown. In the days and weeks following the climactic night, the village remained in a state of uneasy vigilance. Life continued on the surface. Fields needed tending, animals fed, families attended to chores. But beneath the routine lay a persistent tension, a knowledge that something beyond understanding had occurred beneath the church floorboards. Visitors to the village noted the haunted expressions of its inhabitants, the careful steps taken when approaching the church, and the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when strangers neared. The bride's family grappled with unresolved grief and ambiguity. Some maintained the belief that she had survived, hidden somewhere beneath the altar, enduring in a state between life and death. Others accepted her passing, but could not dismiss the inexplicable phenomena. Shadows that lingered longer than they should, sounds emanating from empty spaces, and the sensation, pervasive yet intangible, that they were never truly alone within the church. Each encounter reinforced the notion that the bride's story was not confined to a singular moment in time, but persisted as an atmospheric presence that shaped perception and memory alike. Scientific reflection of the period offers partial explanations. Conditions like catalepsy, hypothermia-induced stasis, or severe syncope could account for episodes where life was mistaken for death. Yet, the persistent sensory phenomena reported by the villagers, including sounds, subtle movements, and visual anomalies, resisted straightforward medical rationalization. It is likely that the combination of environmental factors, psychological stress, and collective expectation created a feedback loop, wherein ordinary occurrences were amplified into experiences of supernatural horror. The church, with its creaking timbers, reflective surfaces, and damp, echoing chambers, became a perfect conduit for such experiences. Community rituals evolved in response. Locals developed practices of caution and respect surrounding the church, prayers muttered upon entering, avoidance of certain pews, and communal gatherings to reaffirm shared beliefs and quell anxiety. The narrative of the bride became woven into the fabric of daily life, a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next. Scholars note that such stories functioned both as entertainment and as social instruction, embedding cultural values about mortality, propriety, and the consequences of misjudgment. Visitors and later historians described the church as a liminal space, where history, memory, and perception converged. It existed simultaneously as a site of tragedy and as a symbol of the fragile boundary between life and death. Those who entered were reminded of human vulnerability, The uncertainty inherent in observing and interpreting the world, and the persistence of mystery even in the presence of reason and scientific inquiry. The bride herself, shrouded in anonymity and mystery, became more than an individual. She transformed into a spectral figure representing fear, curiosity, and the human desire to comprehend what resists understanding. In reflections, both written and oral, villagers debated endlessly. Had she truly survived, buried beneath the altar? Was her presence a lingering echo of fear projected by a community consumed by anxiety? Or did she exist somewhere between worlds, neither fully alive nor fully gone? These questions remained deliberately unanswered, ensuring that the story maintained its haunting potency. Over time, the church itself became a focal point for historians, folklorists, and paranormal enthusiasts. They documented structural anomalies, collected oral histories, and examined contemporary accounts, attempting to parse fact from legend. While definitive evidence remained elusive, the narratives consistently emphasized the unsettling persistence of the bride's presence and the profound impact on the community's collective consciousness. Even today, the story resonates. Tourists and researchers describe entering the church with an acute awareness of history pressing upon them, sensing the weight of unresolved mystery and the enduring resonance of fear. Local accounts emphasize an atmosphere thick with expectation, as though the past refuses to release its hold. The bride buried beneath the altar, whether literal or symbolic, continues to influence perception, inspiring reflection on mortality, human psychology, and the enduring power of a story that refuses to be neatly contained. Ultimately, the epilogue of this dark history is not closure, but contemplation. The bride's tale underscores the precarious line between life and death, the ways in which collective belief shapes experience, and the haunting persistence of events that defy simple explanation. As shadows lengthen in the nave and the flicker of candlelight illuminates the floorboards beneath the altar, visitors are reminded that history is not only recorded in texts and artifacts, but in the enduring echoes of human emotion, fear, and wonder. The bride remains, in memory and in atmosphere, a silent testament to the profound and unsettling mysteries that inhabit both the physical and psychological landscapes of our lives.